So now that we have all this bone broth, what the heck are we supposed to do with it? Well, today I'm going to share with you 5 ways to use bone broth that are more than just drinking it. Hi, sweet friends. I'm Mary, and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, sourdough, ferments, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Well, for those of you who have been with me a while, you know I make a lot of bone broth. And if you're new to my channel, I'll certainly be sure to put a link in the description below and in the iCards above where you can watch a playlist where I make all these different bone broths. But the bottom line is, once we have all these bone broths, other than just drinking them, what can we do with them? Now, before we get to the different ways to use bone broth, and I think you're going to find some of them unique, and I think you're going to be happy to know that there are a lot of ways you can use bone broth in your traditional foods kitchen. But when it does come to just drinking bone broth, you do warm it, and you warm it slowly on your stovetop. You don't want to boil it. And I highly recommend adding a little sea salt, because a lot of you have said, bone broth is kind of bland. What can I do to jazz it up? And even if you add a lot of herbs and spices during the bone broth making process, it can still seem kind of plain. But if you add a little sea salt, it'll really bring all those flavors together and make it a very pleasant beverage to drink. And as I said, just warm it slowly on the stove and then put it in a mug, add a little sea salt, which is not only helping with the flavor, but also adding extra minerals. And I think you'll find that you really enjoy it. So that's the basic way of what to do with bone broth, just warming it and drinking it. But what are some interesting ways to make use of bone broth that can add to our health and also incorporate more into our diet than just drinking it as a warm beverage? And the first way that I like to use bone broth that I think is really wonderful is to add it to smoothies. Bone broth, as many of you have learned, has a relatively mild or bland flavor, and certain bone broths work exceptionally well in certain types of smoothies. Beef bone broth works very well in chocolate smoothies. The taste, is very mild. You're not going to notice it at all. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be adding all of the protein that's in bone broth. Now you're adding that into your smoothie. And so you can add in this, by a cup or 2 cups, whatever you want, in with your chocolate, in with your ice cubes, in with your dairy, whatever the case may be, in whatever way you make your smoothie. And now you've got protein and collagen in your smoothie without having to buy a protein powder or a collagen powder, which can be very expensive. And what about chicken bone broth? Chicken bone broth is great in fruit smoothies. Again, chicken bone broth has a very mild flavor. You're not going to notice it. And you put in a cup or 2, as I said, you've got your protein and the collagen, which is also a protein, but you've got all of the complex makeup of proteins that are in bone broth, and you add this to your fruit smoothie, and you've really, what is it, Emeril Lagasse used to say, kicked it up a notch. You've really improved the nutrition level of your fruit smoothie made with fruit. Now, what about fish bone broth? I know you're saying, Mary, I'm not putting fish bone broth in a smoothie. But you would be surprised. Fish bone broth, again, it's got a very mild, very pleasant flavor, and it's perfect to add to green smoothies. You get those smoothies that you make with kale or endive or escarole, whatever greens you're using, and for your liquid, use fish bone broth. Again, how you're really improving the level of nutrients, the protein, the collagen. You don't need any of those fancy protein powders. You've got your fish bone broth, and it is going to make a delightful smoothie. And I want to share one more thing with you if you're adding fish bone broth to a green smoothie. These are frozen, so I have to hold them a little gingerly. They're very cold. But these are kelp cubes. So if you were thinking that, what's Mary saying, adding fish bone broth to a smoothie, to a green smoothie? These kelp cubes are specifically made for adding to smoothies. And they say supercharge your smoothie. And they've got iodine, calcium, and zinc. And you can add this to a green smoothie with your fish bone broth, my goodness, that's going to be so rich in nutrients. And you're going to love the flavor. You are not going to notice, I use these a lot, and you're not going to notice that you've got some kelp in your smoothie or fish bone broth. It's just going to taste like a really lovely, flavorful green smoothie. And these, you might find these, at your local grocery store, or sometimes you can find them at ethnic grocery stores. I like to buy them from the fish company online that sells a lot of fresh fish as well that I absolutely love. And it's called Vital Choice. And I have a coupon code that you can use if you buy these from them, or any kind of fish that you might buy from them. And I'll put a link in the description below where you can get that coupon code, which will be a nice savings. So do not be afraid to add bone broths to your smoothies. You're going to find that they taste delicious, and you're really going to increase the nutritional level of them. And another great way to use bone broth is to use this in place of water, or just plain, store-bought broth or canned broth that you might get at the grocery store, to use these whenever you make a soup or a stew. Beef stew, beef and barley soup, anything like that. It's perfect for beef bone broth. Chicken stews, chicken soups, anything like that, as well as any kind of bean soup is wonderful when you use chicken bone broth. So don't feel that you're just going to be limited, that, okay, there's beef, so we're going to use beef bone broth. There's chicken bone broth, so we're going to use that in chicken soups and stews and so on and so forth. Both of these are wonderful. The chicken is wonderful. The chicken bone broth is wonderful for your lighter bean soups. The beef bone broth is great for your darker bean soups. So definitely take advantage of using these as your base for whenever you make soups. And fish bone broth, you can't go wrong if you're making a chowder or any kind of fish stew or fish soup. I have a couple of recipes with videos that I shared here on my channel, and I'll be sure to put those in the iCard, and also link to them in the description below, where I've got some nice Italian fish stew and different fish soups that I love to make. And the fish bone broth, I mean, it just really makes the flavor so much more than it would be if you were just using water, and it increases the nutrition. And whenever you make gravies or sauces, definitely use your bone broth. And you can freeze your bone broth when it comes from making gravies. You can freeze them in containers like this. So you've got 2 cups, or some of these also come in smaller sizes. You can freeze them in 1 cup sizes for whatever amount of gravy you may be making. And again, the nutrition, the flavor, it's going to be so much better than using any kind of chicken stock or beef stock that you would buy at the grocery store, or beef broth. It's going to be better in flavor and better in nutrition. And what's nice is if you store them in these sizes, you can just take it out, let it defrost, and you've got it all ready to make your gravy or your sauce. Now, speaking of making sauces, say you're just making a small amount of sauce, like you want to do a little sauce for a steak or something like that. You've grilled it and you've removed it to put on the plate to rest, and now you just want to use the fond and the little bit of juices that are in your pan, and you want to make a nice little sauce to put over your steak or over your chicken, something like that. You can go ahead and freeze these in ice cube trays. So then you've got these little ice cubes of bone broth, and you can just put one of those in and let it defrost right in the pan there and make your sauce. You've increased the flavor and the nutrition, and you save money, because if you've ever seen those cans of like demi-glace, they're very expensive. Now, yes, they're more concentrated than just a bone broth would be, but for home cooking, I think this is more than plenty. And as I said, good flavor and wonderful nutrition, and you'll have a great sauce. Next, another thing that's wonderful to do with bone broths, and any of these, the chicken, the beef, or the fish bone broth, is to dehydrate it. And I have a video where I show you how to do that. And then I have another video where I show how to reconstitute it, how to store it, and then reconstitute it when you're ready to. And I'll be sure to link to that in the iCards and in the description below. And what's nice about dehydrating bone broth is then you have something that's a dry powder. So instead of using a bouillon cube, you've got this wonderful, nutritious sort of homemade bouillon cube or homemade bouillon that you can then use in any way that you would a bouillon cube. You can put it into water and reconstitute it and use it as your base for soups or stews or gravies, sauces, whatever the case may be. But again, it's bone broth. So you've got the whole complete complex of proteins. It doesn't, as you've seen me make in the bone broth, I don't add the salt, so you don't have that high concentration of salt that you get with the bouillon cubes. You can add in your seasonings as you see appropriate. So that's a wonderful thing to do if you've not tried dehydrating bone broth. And so be sure to check out those videos. And that's a wonderful way to use these to kind of extend their life and to make good use of them in your traditional foods kitchen, dehydrating them and then having homemade bone broth bouillon. And another great way to use these, and this is number 5, but I actually have one more bonus tip for you, so to speak, after we discuss this. But for number 5, what I highly recommend is use bone broth in any place that you would use water. And if you make any kind of grain, including rice, use chicken bone broth or beef bone broth. You can even use fish bone broth if you want. If you're serving a nice grain dish alongside fish, it can impart a lovely little mild fish flavor to it, to the grain. So don't feel that you have to not use fish bone broth. And speaking of fish bone broth, I have a video where I show you how to make this. This is so inexpensive to make because you're basically just using the carcass from the fish that you can get from your fishmonger for literally pennies. And you're going to make a whole bunch of fish bone broth and you're going to find so many uses for it. And I'll be sure to link to that video if you've never had a chance to make fish bone broth yet. But in any event, you can use chicken bone broth is great when you're making mashed potatoes. And there are some recipes that call for chicken broth or chicken stock. Use your chicken bone broth. It's fantastic. You're making homemade tomato sauce and you need to add some liquid, add beef bone broth. It's terrific. It gives great flavor to your homemade tomato sauce. And again, with all of this, we're always looking in the traditional foods kitchen to how do we make our foods as nutrient dense, as nutrient rich as possible. These are our secret weapons. So whenever you're making something, barley or farro or rice, any type of grain, definitely use these instead of water. And any recipe that calls for thinning with water or adding water, your tomato sauce, your mashed potatoes, use your bone broths. You will be so happy that you did. And one other bonus way I want to share with you how to use bone broth. And this is a little unusual and it's kind of a very old-fashioned thing, but you can use your bone broths to make aspic. And if you're not familiar with aspic, it's sort of the cousin, for lack of a better word, to Jell-O, except it's savory instead of sweet. And some of you have asked me to show you how to make aspic, and I'll definitely have to do a video on that in the future. But basically what you do is you'll just want to reduce this very slowly until whatever amount you're using by about half. And then you can put it in a mold, or you can even just put it in a pie plate, a glass. It can look very nice in a glass pie plate. And you can put in some, while it's still liquid, some pretty little vegetable cutouts or things like that, and then refrigerate it. And then when you unmold it, it's very pretty. It looks like, you might remember the Jell-O molds, from the 1960s and 70s when I was growing up. That was very common. Aspic kind of goes back even farther than that. And it would be unmolded and have these little vegetables in it and whatnot. And it's very tasty and very pretty. So that's definitely something to think about if you want to do a little vintage cooking. So I hope these ideas have inspired you. And if you'd like to learn more about traditional cooking, be sure to subscribe to my channel. And then click on this video over here where I have a playlist about how to make all these bone broths. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country Kitchen. Love and God bless.